Hey my friends, happy Saturday everyone! The Pittsburgh Steelers have just made a major commitment to the future of their defensive line, and this is a move that could have much bigger consequences than the contract number alone suggests. Keeanu Benton and the Steelers have agreed to a 4-year, $72 million contract extension, a deal worth $18 million per season that makes Benton the highest paid Steelers defensive lineman in franchise history, with the important distinction that this comparison does not include edge rushers. The significance of this decision goes far beyond simply giving a young defensive tackle a new contract. Pittsburgh is making it clear that Benton is expected to be an important part of what this defensive line becomes in the years ahead. And when you look at the timing of this extension, the message becomes even more interesting. Benton is now under contract for the next 5 years when you include the remainder of his current deal, and the Steelers are clearly viewing him as part of the long-term answer on the interior of the defense. The biggest question surrounding this situation is what Benton can become now that he is expected to play in a way that better fits his skill set. The discussion in Pittsburgh has been that Benton has not always been used in the position that allows him to show his greatest strengths, particularly when he has been asked to play as a nose tackle and deal with responsibilities that have limited his ability to attack the quarterback. That is why this $18 million per year figure could look very different in the future, depending on what happens next. Benton has already demonstrated that he can create disruption, and the expectation is that moving him away from the middle of the defensive line could give him more opportunities to attack. Instead of constantly being responsible for absorbing blocks, the idea is to put him in situations where he can use his quickness and power to create pressure and make plays in the backfield. The source specifically points toward Benton playing more of a 3 technique or 4-eye role, with the possibility that he could even see some 5 technique work. Those alignments could give him more one-on-one opportunities, and that could be extremely important for a player who has already shown flashes as a pass rusher. There is also a financial argument behind this move. At $18 million per season, Benton is receiving a significant commitment, but the comparison presented in the source shows that the number is not necessarily outrageous when you look at the current defensive tackle market. The extension for Devontae Wyatt with Green Bay was cited at 3 years and $57 million, or $19 million per season. Benton is therefore coming in slightly below that annual figure while receiving an additional year on his contract. The argument from the source is simple. If Benton takes a major step forward as an interior pass rusher, this contract could eventually look like a bargain rather than an overpayment, and there is evidence to support the belief that Benton can make that jump. Last season, he produced the best sack numbers of his career while also recording a career high in tackles for loss. The source also points out that Benton showed during his rookie season and last year that he has the ability to force fumbles. Those are important signs because the Steelers are not paying him simply for what he has already accomplished. They are paying him because they believe his best football could still be ahead of him. The next part of the equation is how Pittsburgh plans to use him within the defensive rotation. Benton may not necessarily be asked to handle the same early down responsibilities throughout the season. Instead, the expectation described in the source is that he could become particularly valuable in passing situations where his role would allow him to stay fresh and attack opposing quarterbacks. That could make him a dangerous weapon late in games, especially when the Steelers need pressure in critical situations. The source even describes him as potentially becoming a closer for this defense, which tells you how much confidence there is in his ability to create disruption when the situation demands it. But this extension also creates another major storyline for Pittsburgh, because Benton is not the only young defensive player who needs to be considered for a major payday. Joey Porter Jr. is now the next major contract situation discussed in the source. The question is whether the Steelers will eventually give Porter the kind of extension he is seeking, with the possibility of a contract in the $30 million per season range being raised. That is where the situation becomes much more complicated for Pittsburgh. The Steelers may believe Porter deserves a massive extension, but they also have to make sure the salary cap consequences do not create problems elsewhere on the roster. The encouraging part for Steelers fans is that the Benton extension does not automatically mean Pittsburgh cannot also pay Porter. The source explains that the Steelers can structure these extensions so that the larger salary cap consequences arrive in later years. There will be a somewhat higher cap hit associated with Benton this year because of the signing bonus, but Pittsburgh can still theoretically get a deal done with Porter. The problem is what happens afterward. If Porter receives a contract worth $28 million, $29 million, or even more than $30 million per season, the Steelers would have to find additional ways to create room under the cap in future seasons. That means this Benton extension could be the beginning of a much larger financial balancing act. The source suggests that Pittsburgh could eventually have to make difficult decisions involving other players in order to create enough cap flexibility. Highsmith is mentioned as a possible player who could be moved, while Jalen Ramsey is also identified as someone the team could potentially have to consider. Michael Pittman Jr. is another name brought into the discussion, particularly if the team believes Jeremy Bernard is ready to take on a starting role, and Rowan Wilson continues to develop. These are not decisions that have to happen immediately, but they demonstrate how one major extension can affect the roster years down the road. At the same time, there are mechanisms available to the Steelers that can help them manage the situation. Contracts can be restructured, players can be traded, and certain players can potentially be released after June 1st. So even if the salary cap outlook becomes tighter, that does not mean Pittsburgh has painted itself into a corner. The important point is that the organization appears to believe Benton is valuable enough to make this commitment now, while still leaving itself potential paths to keep other important players in Pittsburgh. And that brings us back to the most important question surrounding this entire move. Was Keeanu Benton worth $18 million per season? If Benton becomes the disruptive interior pass rusher that the Steelers believe he can become, this contract could look very different a year from now. The source's assessment is that his move into a position better suited to his strengths could lead to a career year, and if that happens, Pittsburgh could have secured a high-level interior defender for a price that eventually looks much more reasonable compared with the rest of the market. The Steelers have made their decision. They have committed to Keeanu Benton for the long term, and now the pressure shifts to the player to prove that the organization made the right investment. With the contract officially putting him among the highest-paid defensive linemen in Steelers history, and with the expectation that his role will allow him to attack more aggressively, the next chapter of Benton's career could be the most important one yet. So now I want to hear directly from Steelers Nation. What do you think about the Keeanu Benton extension at $18 million per season, and do you believe Pittsburgh made the right decision by locking him up for the long term? And this is where the Keeanu Benton extension becomes even more interesting for Steelers fans, because the contract is not simply a reward for what he has already done. It is a bet on what Pittsburgh believes he can become in this next stage of his career. The numbers from his 2025 season give us a good reason to understand why the organization was willing to make that commitment. Benton finished the regular season with 51 total tackles, 25 solo tackles, 5.5 sacks, and a forced fumble. That 5.5 sack season was the best sack production of his NFL career, and it came while he was still being used in a role that did not always maximize his ability to attack. That is the part that should have Steelers fans paying close attention. If Benton can produce at that level while playing a role that has not necessarily been ideal for him, what happens when he gets more freedom to attack? That is the question Pittsburgh is now betting on. The Steelers are essentially saying that the version of Benton we have seen so far may not be the finished product, and there is an important reason to believe that the move could make a difference. The discussion around his role has centered on allowing Benton to spend more time at 3 technique, 4-eye, and potentially 5 technique. Those terms may sound complicated, but the basic idea is easier to understand. Instead of constantly asking Benton to play directly over the center and absorb blocks, the Steelers want to move him around and put him in positions where his athletic ability can become a bigger factor. That interpretation is also consistent with the explanation published by the Steelers regarding his expected movement along the defensive front. For a defensive tackle, that matters enormously. When you are lined up in a position that allows you to attack a guard or center rather than simply occupy space, you have more opportunities to win with your first step, power, and technique, and Benton has already shown flashes of that kind of disruption. His 2025 production included 5 sacks, while his career totals through the 2025 regular season reached 7.5 sacks, 120 tackles, and 3 forced fumbles. So when Pittsburgh looks at this extension, it is not difficult to understand the upside they are trying to capture. They are not simply paying Benton because he is a young defensive lineman. They are paying him because they believe there is another level available, and that could become especially important as the Steelers continue to manage the transition of their defensive line. The team still has experienced players around Benton, while younger defensive linemen have also emerged. The Steelers' own position review after the 2025 season described Benton as part of a young group around Cameron Heyward and highlighted the increased production Benton provided during the season. That creates an interesting situation. Benton does not necessarily have to become the player who carries the entire defensive line. In fact, his value could increase precisely because he can work within a rotation that gives him specific opportunities to attack. If other defensive linemen demand attention, Benton can benefit from the one-on-one situations that become available. And when the Steelers get into obvious passing situations, that could be where his new role becomes particularly valuable. The source describes the possibility of Benton becoming a designated pass rusher and a late-game closer for the defense. That is a fascinating role because it would allow Pittsburgh to use him when his particular skill set matters most. Instead of asking him to do everything on every down, the Steelers could potentially put him in situations where the objective is simple: get after the quarterback. That also changes the way we should look at the $18 million figure. Right now, that number naturally grabs attention. $18 million per season is a major investment, and Steelers fans have every right to ask whether Benton has done enough to justify it. But contracts in the NFL are not always about paying a player for his past production. They are about projecting future value. If Benton turns into the disruptive interior defender Pittsburgh expects, the conversation around this contract could change very quickly. A player who can consistently pressure quarterbacks from the inside, create tackles for loss, force turnovers, and still contribute against the run becomes extremely valuable